The browser is the framework and the network is the framework. If you understand the fundamental request/response cycle, you can build anything very quickly and it will be really easy to reason about. So that's the number one. We wanted to focus on fundamentals.
Hello, welcome to DevTools-fm. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. We're really excited to have Peter Pistorius on with us today. Hope I said that right. Peter,
Perfect.
Big fan of your work, have followed Redwood.js for a long time and incredibly excited about Redwood SDK. So we're just really excited to jump in and talk about this. But before we get started talking about Redwood, would you like to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Justin. And your excitement is really fueling our enthusiasm for what we're building. So thank you for being there and trying things out and giving us encouragement. So my name is Peter Pistorius. I am South African. A couple of years ago, I worked for a startup called Chatterbug with Tom Preston Warner. And whilst I was there, we started a framework called Redwood.js. And I worked on that for a couple of years. And then I went off and started my own startup, which failed, and I closed it down. And then I went back to Tom, and he asked me whether I would take over leadership of Redwood. So we spun that off as a separate entity, and I'm now the CEO of Redwood. And we pivoted into a new product called Redwood SDK, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, a lot to unpack in just that one sentence right there.
It's been a crazy couple of years. The last 5 years have been insane. Not only just COVID, but also life. It's been
Yeah, maybe one thing to front load. Usually we sort of like talk about this stuff like later on, but you mentioned you're the CEO, you have this product, Redwood SDK. We've talked to a lot of people who are building products around open source tooling and open source software, and there is some fundamental tension with like working a lot in open source and trying to have a monetizable product. And I'm curious, like, what your vision of like Redwood, the business, is. Still want to talk about the framework and maybe give people more context about what we're talking about, but it's still interesting to hear. It's like, how do you think about like balancing open source and, bringing in revenue?
I think that's totally fair. The thing is that sometimes what happens is like a bit of a rug pull. People will build an open source project and then you'll figure out how they monetize it much later once you've invested all your time into it, and that it just doesn't resonate with maybe the ideals of the project that you were invested in. And if you have a look at Redwood SDK's website, we have this idea called personal software. And we're trying to sort of create a movement around an alternative way of building software, which is really software that you build for yourself, your friends, or your family to scratch an itch. That isn't necessarily about building a brand or figuring out a monetization strategy or raising VC funds. And our tagline is actually, this could be the start of something small. So with all that I just said, we're kind of like, we're encouraging people to build software using our open source tool that doesn't have a monetization strategy and isn't necessarily something that they shouldn't necessarily go raise VC funds. And we got money from Tom Preston Warner and Preston Warner Ventures, and we're building Redwood SDK using his money. So the monetization strategy that we have right now is we're going to build a store for source code so that if you build something useful and people like it, and you don't necessarily want to come up with a brand or a monetization strategy or want to support it, you can just sell that source code on our store. People will pay you a yearly license. They'll get access to the code. They can modify it themselves, and then they can run it in their own personal Cloudflare instance. And that's sort of where we are right now. We're trying to, I like to think of it as Steam for source code. Yeah. Let's see how that goes. It's an interesting concept.
That's super fascinating. Maybe before we like go further, let's just like dig into Redwood. So Redwood started as Redwood JS. So can you give us a little bit more context about like technically like how Redwood JS was shaped and sort of like what its ideas were?
Yeah. Yeah. So really, it started off with a tweet, like all good frameworks should. Tom shared a tweet by the Netlify team where they had this new ability to kind of like drag and drop a GitHub repo onto a page, and they would automatically boot up a website on in Netlify's infrastructure. So when I saw that, I said to Tom, "That's really cool. It's such a cool. It reminds me of the old days where we could like FTP a PHP file onto web server, and then you have like something live." And that was backed up by a technology called Lambdas by AWS. And we thought it would be really great if we built on top of that infrastructure. In the 5 years since we've launched Redwood JS, I don't think that Lambdas have changed at all. They've changed very, very little. They haven't improved. And it was our assumption was that this technology will get better over time. So we created a mono repo. Inside that mono repo, we gave you a server side and we gave you a client side. And then the one we'd ship to the CDN, a Netflix CDN, and the other we would ship to an AWS Lambda. And we very quickly I ran into a lot of problems with that. The first one being that the moment you wanted data, you needed a connection to a database. And because there were Lambdas, they would spin up, a new one would spin up for every request. And you'd get into connection pool errors, and there was latency errors and cold start errors. And I think we were too early for what we wanted to build. And the difference is with Redwood SDK, we decided to go all in on the request response model. So we went back to the server, and I wanted to find a platform that included everything you need to build software. So I really wanted you to focus just on the software you want to build rather than the infrastructure that you hosted it on. So I went looking around for a platform that could do that. My number one requirement was that it was worldwide. So I'm in South Africa. If I'm building software for my friends, I want it to be fast for people around here or my community. And I want the same to be true for you in New York. And I want it to be free as well. I wanted you to be able to try it without having to pay, because you might not actually have access to a credit card. I think of myself being an ambitious teenager trying to get things on the internet. And back then I could. There was just like free PHP servers where you could host things. And I'm sure I remember there was something like that for Node in the early days, Ninjitsu or something like that, if I remember correctly. But I don't think that exists anymore. And you're kind of out $20 if you want to host something, and then you need a database, and then you're out another $20. So my idea was, let's find a host. I found Cloudflare. They had, I think, like 330 nodes all over the world. You don't need a credit card to use them. And they just happen to include like a database, queues, file storage, like practically everything you need to build software, the fundamental parts, and then like lots of bells and whistles. So we prototyped on Cloudflare for about a month. And I'm sort of hyper cautious of technology. Usually you get upsides, and the upsides always produce downsides. And with Cloudflare, I haven't found them yet. And I know that sounds ridiculous, and I'm sure they exist, but it is a really, really good platform. So the separation between Redwood JS and Redwood SDK couldn't be further. The one is purely server-side. It gives you server-side rendering with React Server components, and client components, and then it gives you access to the Cloudflare platform with database storage, queues, etc.
We'd like to thank WorkOS for sponsoring today's episode of DevTools-fm. When you're building a SaaS product, integrating enterprise features like single sign-on, directory sync, and audit logs isn't just a nice to have, it's often the unlock for your next stage of growth. And that's where WorkOS comes in. WorkOS offers a developer-first platform that makes adding enterprise functionality feel like any other modern integration. They have SDKs in most popular programming languages and a well thought out API. It's really easy to get started with and easy to stay productive. The docs are genuinely great. They're very clear, very example driven, built to get you from zero to production very quickly. And you'll find helpful guides for most common integrations. So it's really great for getting you started serving your first enterprise customers. And they have a ton of extra features, everything from domain verification to fine-grained authorization, and it's all built with developer experience in mind. So if you're looking to serve bigger customers without drowning in enterprise infrastructure work, definitely give WorkOS a try. That's workos.com. Yeah, it's interesting. So I first heard, or not heard about Redwood, I guess, but was made aware of it by my friend Orta Therox, who I worked with at Artsy. And Redwood JS had an architecture that was very similar to how we built things at Artsy. So React, GraphQL. Orta's a big fan of Relay, so like Relay was pretty much regularly in the mix. And this is like how I thought about web architecture a lot, and there was like a lot of products being built at the time like that. And then seeing Redwood SDK, with server components being very closely tied to Cloudflare deployments, and it does seem like the overall architecture in some ways has gotten a lot simpler. What were the lessons that led from one to the other? Were there like particular like complexities and pain point? Like, why not keep using GraphQL? Like, why just lean into React Server Components? What are the implications? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah, so we have a couple of principles that we invoked when we wanted to build Redwood SDK. But the first thing that I really think about as a developer today is that a lot of what we do is we share memory from one computer to another in a safe way. And every layer you introduce, when you're doing that, adds a layer of complexity. All of a sudden, you need to authenticate in this particular layer. If you think about it, your database is a computer that has memory in it. You need to authenticate against that. Then you include GraphQL or an ORM. Then you include GraphQL, and then you include some kind of HTTP transport. And each one of those has like its own abstraction that allows you to share memory securely. Those abstractions add up, and at the end of the day, it feels like you're not actually coding on the web anymore. You can't actually really fundamentally understand how things are going over the wire. And I think it just makes the experience a lot worse. So with Redwood SDK, it's request and response. It's fetch all the way through. And Cloudflare has this concept called bindings. So a database is accessible to your worker through a variable, and it feels like they're on the same machine. So it feels like you're not sharing memory over the network. You're just saying, "Hey, give me this stuff in the database." That gives you sort of like it. It also makes building software much simpler because we're using the browser as the framework. Like we're using form data, request and response, streaming responses, upgrading fetch requests to WebSockets, etc. And it just works really well. Like that, the people who architected the net really knew what they're doing. They still know what they're doing. They've designed something that's incredibly elegant. And I think that we have abstracted too much of that away in the way that we approach building websites today. So I have this thing that I say, the browser is the framework and the network is the framework. If you understand the fundamental request/response cycle, you can build anything very quickly and it will be really easy to reason about. So that's the number one. We wanted to focus on fundamentals. Number two was we wanted to remove magic. So when you give a framework developer a transpiler, they're going to invent some fancy syntax because they're like, hey, here's a nice way to like remove some boilerplate. If you export things you include some named exports, we will know what to do with that in a special way. But all of a sudden, you start breaking the contract of TypeScript or JavaScript. You're no longer importing and exporting explicitly. You're doing it implicitly, so you can't follow the flow. Somehow those things appear on the page like as if it were magic. And then you have to figure out how to type those things in those magic gaps. So you have a client-side component and you have a server-side component or function. And you're like, how do the types work together? Then we invent TRPC or something along the lines that just gives us the typings. With Redwood SDK, you import the function, it's typed. In the client component, it's typed. We're just leveraging TypeScript. So I wanted to remove all the magic. I wanted you to feel like you were coding in TypeScript. And then the third thing was we really integrated a lot of packages with Redwood.js. We had Storybook and Jest, and we had all this magic around how they were working, and we invented our own syntax. So we made sure that that syntax worked in Storybook and Jest, and it made things really difficult to maintain. Upgrades were a nightmare for the team, and things just slowed down. We couldn't move as fast as we wanted. With Redwood SDK, we're not doing that. We're just a Vite plugin. Everything is stock standard. And if you want to integrate something, we'll provide a really, really good guide on how to do that. And maybe your AI can figure that out for you. But we want to put the power in your hands so that you don't feel locked into our platform either. So I've said this a couple of times to myself. I'm really surprised with what we've produced. It feels incredibly elegant to me. And I do not know why other frameworks aren't like this. I don't know why it took so long to get here. But I have this, I thought about this, and there's this picture of these SpaceX rockets. You've got that Raptor version 1, Raptor version 2 and 3. And every iteration, they get simpler, but they're doing the same thing. And I feel like that's kind of what happened with here. I've been able to build a framework twice in my life. I don't think that that's something that a lot of people get an opportunity to do. And the second time round, I've learned some lessons, and I've brought them to the table.
So the concept of no magic, I think a lot of people will resonate with. I feel like that the first request response, player in the game, was remix, and leaning into those web fundamentals was a big part. But one thing that kind of sticks out to me a little bit is that Redwood SDK is built around RSC, and all the stuff you said about magic and just the things happening without the developer knowing, I'd say do apply to React server components, because they are kind of a very new thing, require deep bundler integration to get right, and do kind of hide a lot of magic that's going on. So how does that kind of play into that ideal?
So I think that I don't really see the magic anymore because I've implemented RSC twice now. So really, RSC is just request to the server. If say for instance you're running an action, man, I could be really wrong here, and someone's like, nope, that guy's wrong. This is my current understanding of RSC. So say for instance you have a client component and you want to perform an action. You click a button, the action gets executed. That's sent to a server over fetch, and it has a whole bunch of stuff at the back of the URL. So it'll be a local host 8910 question mark RSC underscore action, and then it will have a whole bunch of data. Your server will pick that up and it will say, hey, this guy's trying to perform an action. It'll break it apart, figure out what the action was that you were trying to perform, and it will run the function. And then it will return the response of that function along with the newly rendered state of the page that you're currently on. And then that gets diffed on the client, and then you get the new data. So to me, it actually seems really simple. And it's also based on the fundamentals of how we're building software request response. And the state is just pushed to the server. That's your source of truth. So from my perspective, it feels really easy, much better to build software with React Server components than it has felt to build it with other things.
This is an interesting area for me. I've spent a lot of time in the last several years working on APIs, coming from a front end full stack perspective, and I've used tRPC and GraphQL and REST APIs and basically everything else. And there are some real challenges building an API for there's this concept of backend for front end, which people are moving more and more towards. So I think things like Next.js and Remix and all these meta frameworks are sort of backends for front ends. You're writing these functions that are exposed directly to your front end code. Getting them right can be hard. You need sort of a good meta framework experience in a lot of cases just to make it easy to reason about. And there are some, RPC libraries like tRPC, and they just have so much boilerplate, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. So it's the interesting thing for React Server components to me is that you're essentially exposing an RPC interface in a way that like is ostensibly simpler, and especially when you're thinking about the encapsulation of like front end code and server code in this like one component graph. I still think there's like more UX work for the React team to do there, because it's like there are these situations where you get into that are just kind of awkward. It's like, oh, where you're trying to use a client or a server component in this like client component context or something. I don't know. There's like this situation where it starts breaking down, and there's still some UX things, especially around like, I don't know, just giving good errors, like helping people understand the modality, like how to think about these things. And I think that'll be a thing that everyone building on React server components, including Redwood, will have to like grapple with a little bit. It's like, how do we really educate users on like the data flow and how things are happening? Even though it's like one of those things where it like seems simpler, you're like writing less code, you're doing less extraneous types, there's less boilerplate, you're getting closer to the point of just expressing what you want to have happen and it happening, which I think is the ultimate goal with all of this, is like choosing the right abstractions, not to have to write a ton of code to do a really simple thing. But I think there are still these seams where it's just like the UX and DX still need a little bit of pushing there. I think that's a React ecosystem thing.
I think that's totally fair. And, those things have tripped me up as well. And I'd be like, we also have a Justin on our team. And I'd say, hey, Justin, this just isn't working. I think we have a bug. And he's like, Peter, you're doing it wrong. You're actually passing you can't use a server component like this. And I'd be like, oh, of course. Okay. Yeah. Let me try and remember this for next time. And then it tripped one of our other team members up, same error. And I was like, oh, I've seen this one before. This is what you're doing wrong. And he's like, okay. So you're not wrong. I think we can improve that, definitely. And I think the fact that there's such mysticism around it is probably not a good sign. And this is why we are entering the conversation with with Redwood SDK. We want to clarify what's happening and make it easier to understand, without all those layers of abstraction that just feels like you are not doing just a normal network request. So yeah, that's our goal, is really to bring React server components to a group of people that want to build simpler software.
I think the nice thing about this approach, and the thing that's really attracted me to Redwood, which I'm like building a bunch of stuff with Redwood SDK right now. I think the nice thing is just that I'm learning more about React, and I'm not learning more about like some other RPC framework, like that's good. That's nice. I like that.
Yeah. And I have this like really spicy hot take that I like to share, which is like, you have a limited amount of time on Earth, and you're going to spend that time learning something. Why would you spend it learning some big corporate's tools? And, you could Facebook or Meta is a corporate, Redwood SDK, Redwood JS is a corporate, but, we're not going to try and sell you $20 a month hosting. We want to enable you to make a living off the software you're writing, and maybe we take a cut of that. So, learn our thing. It isn't an abstraction. It's really going to give you a fundamental understanding of how the web works, and you can use that anywhere. That might not be true for other tools.
Yeah, it's weird when you start leaning into like the browser's capabilities, like when you haven't for a very long time. Like I've been a web developer for 13 years, and I didn't learn about how form elements worked until probably like 4 or 5 years ago. Now it just like, it sticks with me, and I try to lean into that, and it's way better. But like, we have lived through an era where like almost everything about the web platform was abstracted away.
Totally. I remember like trying to upload files with some kind of like jQuery plugin that somehow gave you a progress bar. And it was wild. And I was super surprised to see how easy it is to upload a file in Redwood SDK. Like, create a form, push that form up using fetch, grab the file out of the form data in the server handler, and just stream it directly into R2. It's like 4 lines of code. And then retrieving it and sending back to the client is the same operation, just reversed. It's just fetch, and then you're just streaming it over the wire. It just feels so right. You're like, wow, someone really thought this through. It wasn't me. I just gave you all the dots to connect it with.
Cool. So you built this all around Cloudflare, and that seems to be a central thing that is very important. Do you expand to? Do you plan to expand it to other platforms in the future?
Right now, no. I think, one of the problems that we had with Redwood JS is that we stalled on growth. And I want to make sure that we're serving a group of people really well. And I think Cloudflare's positioning is so unique and so important in the hosting world today that I don't think there's a downside to using them. And I can put on my tinfoil hat and think about scenarios where it would not work out for us or anyone trying to build on Cloudflare. But I just don't think that those are realistic, and it's not something I'm going to worry about right now. And you shouldn't either.
Yeah, that's. I mean, Cloudflare is such a good platform. It's really coming into its own, especially now. It seems like they're having a lot of good traction.
Yeah, they have a really solid engineering team and culture. It's surprising. Like, I'm surprised that I didn't get into it earlier. It feels like, where have you been all my life?
So there's something else I wanted to talk about. So you'd mentioned this earlier. Redwood JS, the original framework, had a lot of stuff built into it. And it's providing a lot of direct integrations. I'm doing a lot of custom things around those integrations. It made your velocity harder. And so now you're building Redwood SDK to be a lot more modular, a lot like smaller core, trying to solve less problems all up front. But you also have this goal of like, oh, well, we want people to build like personal software. We want it to make it like easy and understandable and like let you solve the goals that you need to solve right away. So it's like, how do you balance the tension of baking things in because it's easy and people don't have to think about it and just be super opinionated and say, here's how you do X, versus like, we don't want to overload this with a bunch of complexity. And maybe we want to give people the flexibility to use whatever is appropriate for their use case, or whatever it may be. What's the balance between that, and how do you think about like putting things into core versus like not?
So for us, it pretty much hinges on the browser. If the browser offers something that can do what we want it to do, we will lean into that. And I'll give you an example. Like with sessions, we're just using cookies, and we're using Cloudflare's durable objects to store that session information. And then with authentication, we also provide WebAuthn. And I think that that's a really, really good solution that's future proof. But you can use anything you want yourself. It's just that we're not handing that to you. Also, if it's a commercial entity that's offering some kind of service, I'm very cautious of including that. Like, if you have to configure it using some sort of secret key, I'm probably not going to add that as a default in the SDK. And I tell you why. The reason is like my brother is learning how to program. He's a technical guy. He's always wanted to code. It just didn't work for him. A couple of months ago, he came to me and he's like, "Hey, Peter, I built this thing," and I opened it up on my computer and it was a web page. And I was like, "What? How did you do this?" He's like, "Yeah, I used this thing called Cursor. I was still VS Coding back then. I used this thing called Cursor. I could speak to it and it could speak to me in a way that made it understandable." And I was like, "Where is this hosted?" And he said, "It's on Vercel." And then I said, "What's your database?" And he says, "It's Neon." And I was like, "Whoa, how did you make these choices?" He's like, "The AI made it for me." And I was like, "Interesting." It's like, "But it's costing me money." And I was like, "Okay, interesting. And he said it was also really difficult to go from development to production. And he didn't really understand the security implications of that connection between Vercel and his Neon database. And I was like, okay, there's something here that whenever you're connecting to an external service and you have to provide an API key or actually, let me back up a little bit. I like to think of it as if you're paying 5 taxes. So number one, you want to choose an authentication service. You go on the internet, you do a bunch of research, you figure out which one resonates with you in terms of price and brand and whatever you like. Then you sign up. Then you give them your credit card. Then you learn what the API does. You make it work locally. Then you make it work in production. those are 5 different taxes that you have to pay before that service is actually usable in your day-to-day flow for building software. I don't want that. I think that that's really the hard part of what software is nowadays, is connecting all these services together. So if you have this just Cloudflare binding where it actually feels like it's on the machine that you're busy coding on, that feels like magic. And in the local development environment, the Cloudflare has provided an emulator called Miniflare, and Miniflare gives you access to database, durable objects, queues, even AI. So you give it your Cloudflare account when you sign in with this thing called Wrangler, and then you can access all the AI models in your local development environment, and you ship it to production. One command, PNPM release, and it's live and it's working. Like that was the most surprising thing for me, that when I shipped to production, it worked. But what was even more surprising for me was that I was surprised by that. It's like my expectation should be that it just works. But I've been sort of trained in the last like 20 years of my career that shipping to production means you're shipping something that's breaking, and then you subsequently try and fix it. And that hasn't been the case at all with Cloudflare. I'm like, well, it's working. And it's great. It's a great experience.
This episode is sponsored by Mailtrap, an email platform that developers love. Go for high deliverability, industry-best analytics, and live 24/7 support. You can get 20% off for all plans with the promo code DevTools. Check out the details in the description below. Something that I think will be really interesting for y'all to figure out, and probably aligns with kind of how you've talked about this conceptually, is Redwood is going to need a really good plugin system, more so than like anything else. And so let's talk about the auth, for example. So you have auth configured in your standard example starter kit or whatever. So that comes through, that sets up the durable object, has all these things. But it's just like, it's like ejected code. It is like just code that lives in the thing. It's like, it's a template, right? And so if you're thinking about that changes under the hood and how y'all like, you're adding new features to it or whatever, like people aren't getting that. And this is going to be one of the interesting things for you to solve, because you're also thinking about like, oh, well, we want you to like be able to sell functionality. So it'll just be interesting to see how you approach that problem in the future. And it's just like, I have a personal project that I'm working on right now for like social good, essentially. And I'm using Redwood SDK, and I chose to use Better Auth, which is an open source package that's like trying to compete with like Clerk and a bunch of these other services that are doing auth, but they're just like, we're just open source. You own your users table. Here's, this thing, integrate it however you want. And my experience integrating that with Redwood has been really positive. And I think this will be it goes back to like, this will be the interesting thing. It's like, if y'all can figure out how to like package up and make these things configurable, then you do have that opportunity to sort of like sell plugins and extensions as a sort of a meaningful mix in to an existing application. But it also give you the ability to like keep Redwood SDK core really light, which I think is going to be super critical for y'all going forward.
Totally. So I mentioned earlier that we were thinking of this store for source code. One of the fundamental ideas that I really love about React is this ability to co-locate things. You have your components, your styles. You put them together. If the code changes frequently together, you keep them in the same space. I think Ken C. Dodd said that. And one of the things that really frustrated me when I was building websites was you would have your components on one side, their styles alongside them, and then you have API routes, and they're like completely off in this other place. And that's it just feels so disjointed. You're like, these pages speak to this stuff here, but they're nowhere near each other. So with Redwood SDK, we give you the ability to co-locate your API routes and your JSX routes in the same file, and you can export that just using an array. So you say export const routes equals an array of routes, and then when you plug that into your worker, you use prefix, and then you supply those routes, and then it will prepend a string at the beginning. And then we also give you the ability to control the document. So the root element of where your JSX components are rendered, you can control that. So with Redwood SDK, you can turn off React if you want to. You can turn off client-side hydration. You can just send HTML down the wire, or you can turn that React fetch interface into a real-time interface with durable objects, and we actually supply that as something that you can do. So like, people really have control over every byte over the wire, and we're going to introduce something called add-ons that give you the ability to plug in like a forum or comments, or I don't know. I used to be a Django developer, so they actually had something called add-ons, contrib.add-ons, and you could bring stuff into your website that were contributed by other people. And I've never seen that pattern repeated in a JavaScript framework. Maybe it does exist, but we're going to make that something that's first class, that feels like you are in control of the actual source code. And we will probably leverage AI in order to help you do that, like an MCP server and AI to bring those things into your stack. And then you have the code there, and you can modify it like kind of like shad for what would I say? Shad for sections? I don't know. Yeah, that's the idea. So, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that I'm super excited about. It feels like, why am I reinventing these things? And if I want to use them through a package, that's also not really possible. I can't bring components and UI and routes and all that other stuff. So we need something else.
Yeah, that's a super interesting idea. Plugins like that, it doesn't feel like it's something that's been explored. In general, it seems like you guys are doing like unique things with your APIs. So one that stood out to both of us was your routing configuration. Like the way you define middlewares is like both. It's like the simplest I've ever seen. It's like immediately like recognizable what's happening, and it's like what you said earlier, where it's like, wait, why did we do it the other way? Like, this just seems like so simple and obvious. Like the same thing goes for interceptors. So could you explain like where the inspiration for that API came from?
So number one, I looked at Remix. I think Remix router. I looked at what they were doing, and I was like, wow, this is really nice. I love the way that they're calling the functions, etc. And then I wanted to focus really on the request response model. So in my mind, I was like, a request hits this function, and it runs through a set of functions in an array, step by step. So it begins with middleware where, and we'll run each one of those, and you can modify the context, and then it figures out which route you're matched to. And then in that route, you can also introduce something called the interrupter, where you can say, okay, if this user in the context is not authenticated, then return abort early, like interrupt the reflow and suggest that the person needs to log in and redirect them to the login page. So I wanted to give you both global control over the request and then more fine-grained control over the request. But I wanted you to also have the ability to share those little like interrupters throughout your code base. So you could say, is this an admin user? Is this a authenticated user? And just reuse those everywhere. Because when you're actually reading the code and parsing it with your eyes, you can see what's happening. You're like, this is an authenticated route. I think there's nothing worse than like shipping something to production and you forget to include the fact that this user needs to be authenticated simply because you couldn't see it. And that certainly, you could still do that today, but it's much easier to understand where it's happening. Yeah, so for us, the request response model is our like beacon of truth, and we try to orientate ourselves around that understanding of how the web should be built.
I think there's like some other things that are interesting to point out here. The way that you define a Redwood SDK app, you have this define app function, it takes an array, functions at the top are middleware, and you have this like route structure that's below that. The interesting thing about this is the shape of this looks a lot like how you define like vite config with like define config. The important thing is to note is like that makes it very typable. A complaint that I hear about middleware all the time is that you can't carry over types from middleware to routes or whatever. It's like, people are like, oh, magic is happening in middleware. I don't know what's going on. And there's all these like awkward type mechanisms, and people put generics on the router itself and like do all these weird things. But the interesting thing is how you've actually architected this is you can do type inference from the middleware down to other things. I don't know if you're actively doing that now, but like the shape of it allows you to do that, which is like, an interesting point, just to think about like how that could be shaped in the future.
Totally.
Yeah, I have used Remix a lot or React Router a lot and other projects. And I mean, I think they're working on middleware now, but historically they haven't had middleware and have had strong opinions about like not needing middleware. And I worked at Oxide Computer Company, and they have a HTTP like library that they built, or a request library that they built or whatever, that doesn't have middleware either. They have like the same sort of opinions. There's like all these opinions about like middleware being this, thing that can be confusing because it's like happening and it's not non-obvious when you're working on, code for a route, like what could be happening. But I think it's like actually fundamentally important because there are just things that have to happen globally.
Totally.
And also the longer I work on web projects, the more that I deeply believe that you need to be really focused on the problem that you're solving in any one part of your code. And I think that you've done a good balance with like the interceptors are like sort of just like middleware per route. Like this sort of model just like makes a lot of sense. And like you said, it was like, you can just glance at it and it kind of reads. And I think that's huge. Like, I don't know. So yeah, big fan of the shape of that.
Thanks for saying that. Like, I'd like to take credit for that and say we just came up with it and it ended up being really amazing. It almost feels like we discovered this by accident, like the router and the way that we define apps. It was just an iterative process, and it just came out looking like that. And we were like, "Whoa, this is really great!" And we were all kind of shocked at it, at what we had built. So I don't know where that came from exactly. Maybe just 20 years of experience, feeling the pain of building software, not really understanding exactly where things are flowing through the stack, and wanting to give people that fundamental understanding so that they can take that forward into their careers and build good software moving on. And like if you're focused on request response and you're using sessions, then you need middleware. So it was like maybe the fact that we're focusing on the browser made us make decisions that make sense, and those decisions make sense because you're building for the browser. That's your customer. and also like we really felt that we didn't want to generate anything for TypeScript, even though there's a little bit of stuff that's generated for Cloudflare. We will never introduce any kind of generated types. I think if your design time and your build time are out of sync with one another, because you have to run a process to generate types, that's something that I'd love to avoid. I don't like doing that. I want TypeScript to be first class and not some kind of thing where I'm inventing syntax based on generation.
So moving on to like the bigger visiony things that have to do with Redwood, we alluded to it earlier, but the big talking point is personal software and some software that you can build and own yourself. So what does that mean to you and like the vision going forward?
Yeah, I think we got called out on being somewhat nostalgic, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal story about myself. I'm a guy from South Africa that finished school in the year 2000, and I lived in a rural community, and I was really into my computer, and I saw all my friends were in the United States. Everything that I was interested was in the United States, and I couldn't enter that conversation because I lived too far away. And when I think about personal software, I think about my journey in trying to become a better developer, eventually getting to work with Tom Preston Warner, which was for me a milestone in my career. And I want to bring that to other people in the world. So for me, I want to give people fundamentally good pieces of technology so that they can improve their communities, and build software for themselves that really scratches an itch. That's not necessarily orientated around building a business. I don't think there's anything wrong with building a business, but when you focus on that exclusively, the shape of the thing that you're building is very different. All of a sudden, you need hyper growth or VC money, and if you live in a place where that isn't accessible, you're not going to build anything. So I'm saying, hey, solve your problems. You have friends in a community, build things that make their lives better, and that's it. Like that's good enough. Maybe you get a career out of that, or maybe it blows up to be something huge. You never know, but unless you try, you're never going to figure it out. And alongside that, I think there's this massive group of people that are starting to build software, the vibe coders, or the people picking up agents, and these are technical people that have a passion for something, but not necessarily the experience to pick the right parts. And I want to give them something that makes them feel like they're empowered, without getting taken advantage of. Like, I don't want you to learn some corporation's technology for the sake of them being able to charge you $20 a month. Like that, to me, I don't know, it just doesn't seem right. Doesn't sit right with me. Anyway, I don't think there's anything wrong with making money. I love making money. I want to make money from Redwood SDK. But I think for now, I think software is going to fundamentally change in that we can scratch our own itches. Yeah. End rant.
Yeah, no, I definitely resonate with this. I have a few websites that I've like carried along with me for like 10 years. If I tried hard, I could have maybe made them into a business and like burnt some VC money. But like in the end, they were just like for me, and I was the only user. And I'm very excited to see what the future holds when that experience is like a generally accessible one. Because
Yeah.
it previously wasn't, and with the advent of AI tools, it very much is. Like your brother generating websites. Like I love that future, and I just can't wait to see what happens and like all the weird software that comes out of it.
Awesome. And the hard part, if the hard part isn't writing code, the hard part is hosting it. And that's why we did what we've done. The platform that Cloudflare provides gives you a good solid basis to start on. Yeah.
This is something related to this, and I think the message, nostalgic may it be. Of course, I'm a '90s kid, so it strikes home for me. But there is this just notion that there are a lot of societal problems that software could help with that just aren't VC shaped.
And we haven't solved them.
Yeah. Because it like takes too much time, too much energy. It's just not worth the engineering effort that goes into, doing these like fundamentally like good for society things. And this is something I think about a lot. I've got a side project right now that working on to like help people find lost animals, right? And it's like not a thing that's going to make probably any money. And also it's like something that there are companies out there that are solving this in a way that it feels like kind of exploitive. And I've been thinking a lot over the years about like what these shapes of opportunities are, and like if they're even opportunities, how do you put software out for this? So I don't know. I'm glad that y'all are thinking about it through this lens, because I think we need more out there in the world that's just like, here's a platform for like building something that needs to be built, but it's like maybe not the, not the VC version of this needs to be built, or like the expensive B2B SaaS version, or whatever it may be.
Totally. And I think there's like, I've been trying to search for a term for the pain that I felt when I sometimes build software. There are things that I just fundamentally don't enjoy, and I procrastinate when I approach them. And AI has completely stripped that away from me. I just lean in, and I'm always in flow, and I'm building cool stuff, and it feels like I can do anything. And I think because of that, like, it really enables us who are experts. We're not even learning. We can just spread. We can build so much stuff and really enjoy the experience. I'm really excited for the future of what we can achieve with software.
So I love this vision. I love the personal software vision. I'm a big fan of what you're building with Redwood, using it in a lot of projects right now. So I guess my question for you right now is, you seem to have this like grander vision of like being able to give people a toolkit where they can buy or sell new components and build up these like small personal projects, or small software businesses. But like, what does the immediate future look like? What is the next 1 to 2 years for Redwood? What are you really focused on? What do you really want to get shipped?
So the first thing we're going to do is hit 1.0. Right now, we're sort of positioned ourselves as open beta, whilst we're trying to wrap up some APIs. And the second thing that we're going to do is release the marketplace for source code. If in 2 years we have people actively shipping on there, finding people who love their code and installing that in their own instances in Cloudflare, that to me will feel like a personal success. Like if we can change the course of what people are building into this like more modular, buy my source code kind of thing, I think that would be wonderful. And I love open source, but maintainers of open source traditionally don't get anything for the efforts that they put in. And then, you could probably just upload your code to our store for free anyway. But I'd love for people to earn some money through doing what they're doing. And like there's some prolific developers on npm, Cinder. I'm probably not saying his name correctly, but I think he probably has like all the packages on npm. I'll use at least 10 of them, and I know that he works that's his full-time gig. And I'd love for people to be able to do that through Redwood SDK, to find a place where they're just actively writing software as their job and just scratching their own itches and selling it. Yeah, and GitHub stars. So that is one of our. I'm being facetious, but please star our project, because it helps us prove that we have people engaged with what we're doing. Yeah, I want more stars than anyone else.
Well, if you can make a dent in funding software developers like that, that would be huge. Like literally just the other day, like I've been working on a side project that is like a React component for window splitting. I've probably put like 2 months of my off time into it. And like I'm just giving it away for free. It's because there's not really any easy way for me to not do that. So if we could foster an environment where that's an easier thing to do, I would love to see it.
Yeah, and it's like you wrote this thing, you found it useful. Perhaps some other people do. So just put it on there and see what happens. And if you come to our store with the intention of actually buying something, or you're like, I'm busy building something right now, I need a forum, or I need this component that does this thing, and it's for sale, you're going to buy it. You're just going to be like, all right. Also, I mean, it's not like $1,000 or whatever. Maybe it's just $5, like anything really. But you've exchanged that value. You said, thank you. You did something great for me. I don't have to write this. I'm going to put it into my code. I own the code as well. I can't redistribute it, but I own the code, and I can modify it for my own needs. I think that feels good. And because the platform that we hosted on is the same thing, I don't have to integrate like 12,000 different services. I can also just test it on Cloudflare to see if it actually works. So you can validate if it's doing the thing that you need it to do.
Yeah, there isn't really that like cheap to like medium price point for like selling stuff. Like if you want to do charts in React and you want to buy a library for that, that's going to cost you like $2,000 per developer per year. It's like crazy that it's like either you give away your work for literally $0 or it's $2,000 a head.
Well, one of the things that I always find so funny and like frustrating is like when you find one of these charting libraries, they'd be like, this is enterprise. This is an enterprise charting library. And you're like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean the documentation is worse? Or like, yeah, it's about the price, obviously.
Yeah, well, with that, that wraps it up for our questions. Thanks for coming on. This was just a very interesting journey into both the history of Redwood and how we got here, React server components, and all this personal computing stuff. So many different things to be excited about. So thanks for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you so much. I'm here for the personal software revolution. And the reason why I'm calling it personal software is because I think of the era of personal computing where people had to convince you to put a computer in your home. I'm trying to convince you to write your own software. Like, put your own software on our store and, scratch your own itch. Now's the time.
Well, yeah, thanks, Peter, for coming on. And I'm excited to see this future and hopefully participate in it. This is, it's a good cause. So I'm here for it.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it. Cool.